distant trumpet? Can you hear the clarion call? Or stand you idly dreaming and hear no tone at all? Do you feel the earth a tremble as your enemies assemble, with war horse hooves abounding and with challenge feast resounding? Do you see the sunrise gleaming on the spears and banners streaming? Can you hear the crushing battle of the war drums call to battle? Or do you sleep, my friend, and droop your head with awe? Rise up, rise up, rise up. We can break the chain. Rise up, let freedom ring again. For while we slept upon our grave, to the foreman vantage gate, we sowed therein which we must reap the harvest of our slothful sleep. By traitors led, by traitors sold, for blood-stained chests of traitors gold. Australians rise and rise no more, for death is nigh the fatal shore. Honor now your father's blood, for freedom shed in crimson flood. Yet honor more above all things the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. For if we do, he will abide, and he will stand and stem the tide. Rise up, rise up, rise up. We can break the chain. Rise up, let freedom ring again.
I've slowed down a bit since I first started. It's actually 40 years since I started speaking full time, so I've got to read I've got a lot I want to get through tonight, so I'm going to read it, and I hope you can bear with me. I hate reading stuff, but I've got to do it. We're now in mid-March 2007, and we've just had another drop in the stock market, the world stock market. The second in 2 weeks. The first one started with a 9% slump in China, of all places, which is the fastest growing economy in the world, and that shook everybody, and Wall Street slumped, and then that came back, and we've just had another one, and that's coming back, and we're in that phase that happened just before 1929, when the stock market was going up and down like a yo-yo. But the evidence is this can't keep going much longer. If you forget all the stuff the pundits say and have a look at the actual data, the debt crisis that rips the world apart, we've reached, I think, the point of no return. The eternally cheerful economic pundits are emphatic this is just another hiccup. Well, there's nothing worse than a painful death from hiccups, as far as I understand. The ostensible cause of the current hiccup is a mortgage crisis sweeping the United States. The huge family debt, household debt in America is catching up now. The last estimate I heard was about 1 million homes are being foreclosed on, their mortgages. That's 1 million people are going to lose their abodes, and that was followed by another estimate that this was going to rise very quickly to 1.5 million. And all Australians I met thought, well, thank goodness we don't live in the United States if that's what's going on. So heavy is the load of debt upon the backs of the American households that close to 1 million mortgages are being foreclosed on. But this direct impact on the ordinary citizens of the United States is not a one-off that can be viewed in isolation. It is the end result of cumulative impact, the impact of decades of debt piled one on top of the other, debt for wars, debt for weapons, which must be regurgitated with every bomb and bullet expended, debt for every helicopter shot down, debt for every warship and aircraft, debt for every military base, and the United States now has over 130 bases in 80 countries. Debt for every Guantanamo Bay gulag, debts for every congressional election, and if you think our elections are extravagant, you want to have a look at the total cost now of trying to get a president into office in the United States in that 1 year of fabricated lies that they passes for democracy now, dividing the country into two footy teams that play each other more and more fiercely, and you're never sure which one has won when the final vote is taken, because they're all done by electronic counts that are often owned by people who have a vested interest in one party or another. Not like us, not like us. So, debts for every congressman, for a huge top-heavy administration, for pensions stretching into the future, for servicemen and women who have died or been maimed in the numerous wars of the past and the present, and of course to pay the compounding interest on the unpaid debts of ancient and modern history, which are now rolled over so the country can stagger on towards the next man-made disaster. I was quoted a figure the other day which claimed that over 60% of all prices, and this is not just America, this is throughout the world now, certainly the industrial world, 60% of every price on every article is interest on debt. Compounding, adding, extending the gap between purchasing power and prices to the point where no matter how great your production, how vast your economic system, more and more people can't keep up with the sort of lifestyle that a modest person would expect. From a safety pin to a car, from the water we drink to the food we eat, is interest on debt. I have no way of documenting such a claim, but I would imagine it is conservative and also cumulative. If you are thinking how foolish Americans are to allow themselves to be enveloped in such a debt quagmire, don't be too complacent or sanguine. Australia, cited by a World Bank survey as the richest per capita nation on the face of the earth, is doing its best to outstrip the United States in debt aggregation. As we all know, we are to have a federal election within months. The current coalition government says it will rely on its economic credentials to win another term. We're still a booming economy, claims our treasurer, who deserves a star role in the BBC comedy Some Mothers Do Have 'Em. The bumbling, dyslexic Frank Spencer was incapable of the sort of disaster Costello has made. When Howard and Costello gained office in March 1996, after 13 years of disastrous financial policy under Hawke and then Keating, our treasurer campaigned around Victoria in what he called the debt bus. You remember that? Which highlighted the massive foreign debt that Labour had run up. "We'll fix it," he crowed as he clawed his way to the top of the dung heap. Well, roosters today, feather dusters tomorrow. Peter was all set to succeed John Howard as the world's greatest Prime Minister after a prolonged stint as the world's greatest treasurer. There was a lot of scratching and crowing on the top of the dung heap between Howard and Costello. It's more like Jack and Jill. John fell down and broke his crown, and Pete came tumbling after. Well, we all need a laugh now and again, but the debt figures this pair of rascals will leave behind makes one more inclined to cry. When they got in 1996, Australia's foreign debt was 180 billion, and Peter Costello was, rightly, screaming like a banshee. At the end of February this year, it was 512 billion, just under 3 times as much in 10 years. They've tripled our foreign debt. They couldn't even ensure that the richest country in the world could pay for its imports with exports and balance its books. Instead, it got sucked into the alluring myth of free trade and the market, wrecking our farming and manufacturing industries in the process. And they have wrecked them. They have wrecked them. They've wrecked our sugar industry and our wheat industry and our fruit industry and our manufacturing, and this, they claim, is a booming economy. It had a far sale of Australian assets already paid for by the taxpayers of the past. They paid off Canberra's debt by the simple expedient of tripling the debt on the backs of Australian households. The ordinary people who produce the goods and services and raise the families of the future. Did they at least reduce taxes? Not a bit of it. Taxes reached the highest level in Australia's history, but they're never enough to overcome the cost structure of the debt-based welfare state. We can't afford enough teachers, enough doctors, enough police, enough pensions, enough old people's homes, enough housing, enough roads, enough apprenticeships, enough defence, enough university places. So modern elections, instead of being an exercise in democracy, are a competition in abuse and bribery. While opposing parties call each other with every kind of abuse, they bribe us with our own money. And all the while, like the song says, each of us get another day older and deeper in debt. We all sing it, we all know it. In 1996, when Howard and Costello gained office, average household debt was about 60% of average household income. For every Australian family, on average, 60% of their annual income was their debt. Within 5 years of their tenancy, this ratio had increased to 100%. Today, in March 2007, the figure has reached 160%. Credit card debt, mortgage repayments, plus ever-rising costs of living have left Australian families stretched to their utmost limits. The world's richest nation has 10% of its population living in chronic poverty, with a large number homeless. And John and Pete, alias Jack and Jill, want us to vote them back at the coming election. At the very least, they need an American version, an Australian version of the 9/11 disaster in the United States to have any chance at all. And I suspect by the time we finish this weekend, we'll find that 9/11 was part of the election process. On the whole, those who attend the Inbrail Forum, many of whom have been here year after year, are better informed than the average Australian. They know we're in trouble and are being denied the truth. Every time we have an election, they hope for some miraculous change which will restore things to their former certainty and prosperity. Occasionally, one or two cleanskins are elected, and boy, they're rare. We've got one here tonight, Len Harris. What a tremendous example. What a contrast he was to the average party politician. He actually spoke the truth. And so he was a welcome guest here. I wonder what had happened if John Howard came to the Inbrail Forum. They'd have a few articles in the Australian about that, wouldn't they? Occasionally, one or two cleanskins are elected who strive valiantly against impossible odds before being eliminated at subsequent elections, or sinking back into obscurity, unable to keep banging their heads against the wall. More and more can see that the battle is now much greater than simply exchanging bad politicians for good ones, even if there was some way of identifying the latter before they're elected. And of course there isn't. Many here today have recognized that the situation in this country is simply part of a global process seeking to establish a new world order, described more politically correctly as globalization, where nation states and national boundaries are eliminated in favor of world government. Many of us have tried to illustrate and expose this process for decades, and to warn people of the dangers all this poses. We can identify each further erosion as it occurs. My own conviction now is that we have lost our political and economic sovereignty, as had the other nation states in the world: Britain, France, Canada, New Zealand, the Third World, the United States. Real power has shifted away from the governments we elect to banks and the corporations they own. We live in a corporatized world owned by an elite, which the British author Nicholas Hager described in his 2004 book as The Syndicate. When published 2 years ago, his book was subtitled The Story of the Coming World Government. Now, 2 years later, my conviction is that world government is finally here. It's a done deal. It's a fait accompli. Even down to the approaching compulsory identification, surveillance, and tracking of all human beings. Even down to control of the very water we drink, which droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath, passing through the tax department on the way. Obviously, there's a lot of mopping up to do. Wars still rage on every continent. People will still starve to death in their millions. Plagues are rampant. The four horsemen of the apocalypse stalks us all. But if you own and control corporations of the world, you regard such events with as little concern as the death of a sparrow. If you think I'm a one-off prophet of doom, let me assure you that more and more thinkers are saying the same thing. Each continent is producing its own Ciceros, like the Roman Empire, trying to warn what is happening. Listen to this description by the American veteran diplomat and negotiator Joan Vion, who says it better than I can. She was in at many of the conferences setting this up. And finally she began to speak out. This is what she said. As a student of history, I have read about Babylon, the Egyptian, Greek, and Roman empires, King Richard the Lionheart and the Crusaders, the change in a country's banking system from one controlled by government to one controlled by private corporations known as central banks, the history of America and its fight by colonists for freedom from the hold of the British king, the rise of a group of men who met in secret to create a movement to bring the world into world government, the exploits of Napoleon, who wanted to be crowned Emperor of Europe, the rise of communism and Fabian socialism in the 18th century, the Opium War in China, which was begun by the British so they could control world drug trafficking, the Boer War in South Africa, fought against honest people by the British and Cecil John Rhodes, take their property, which contained the richest diamond fields in the world. The fall of the Tsar in Russia, as his country became the first communist-ruled government in the world. The rule of President Franklin Roosevelt, who confiscated gold from the common man and who worked tirelessly to put in place the foundation for a world government system and World War II. As baby boomers, we are no longer able to read about history, for it is now our turn, our time. While the above constitutes a first time in history list, there are as many astounding things that have happened in the last 65 years that are also for the first time in history. In 1944, for the first time in modern history, the finance ministers of the world met in New Hampshire to set in place a new international structure for how the monetary system of the world should be set up. At that meeting, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank were put in place. While the United States Senate refused at that time to ratify a type of World Trade Association, tearing down the trade barriers between countries would have to wait until 1994, when the 27,000-page plus General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs was passed by a lame duck Congress. A year later, in 1945, a world governmental organization by the name of the United Nations was set up. Not since the Roman Empire during the time of Christ has the world seen a global government, parliament. That same year, another global organization was set in place, the United Nations Educational, Cultural and Scientific Organization, UNESCO. Its goal is to change how people think. And it now owns, of course, much of Australia, because UNESCO is in charge of our World Heritage Areas, apart from anything else. In 1998, the International Criminal Court was birthed. For the first time since the Roman Empire, there is now an international court to try those who have committed a number of international crimes. This body has the power to transcend sovereign country borders in order to search, seize, and arrest the alleged criminal. In 1999, we were part of a global propaganda ploy called Y2K. While we were told computers would shut down, that's not what it was all about. The whole purpose was to connect the world electronically in time for the third millennium. As a result of the attack on the World Trade Center, the remaining and most sensitive barriers between the countries of the world fell, the military and intelligence barriers. The result is today that we live in an interdependent and integrated world. President John Kennedy in 1962 called for a declaration of interdependence. Every president since then has referred to some type of integrated world or new world order. For the first time since Rome, the world is interconnected. There are no more barriers between the nation states. As each international institution was set in place, the barriers between the nation states vanished. Economic, political, educational, trade, legal, communications, intelligence, and military. In our lifetime, we had the birth of television, which at first was a blessing, but 55 years later has lulled to sleep a populace that once was vigilant. Furthermore, we have a citizenry which would rather depend on the nightly news for truth rather than searching it out. While there have always been the international traders throughout history as civilizations evolved, today we have the powerful transnational corporation, which owes allegiance to no country. These corporations have evolved in power and position since the 1950s and are powered by individual and institutional investors in the form of mutual funds, foundations, pension and profit-sharing plans. For the first time in history, we are seeing the rise of a global stock exchange, with the merging of the New York Stock Exchange with the Euronext and the potential merger of the Nasdaq with the London Stock Exchange. Because there are no more barriers between the nation states, not only do the corporations run wild, but it is now possible for those with large amounts of money to skim off the top of the world's markets. Every time the market drops 100 or 500 points, it is quite possible that those who control the market are making a gigantic killing worldwide. For the first time in history, during the late 1990s, key governments moved to put in place an international economic architecture to accommodate an economically integrated world. Part of this new infrastructure was to repeal key post-depression laws to protect the average investor. While we think of that, how many billions have been made by people in the know about the latest stock market drop, 9%. For the first time in history, we are seeing the rise of a world governmental system through the United Nations. In the past 61 years, more international law has been set in place than at any time since 1625, when it first became a study. Every time the United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution, international law is made. The United Nations ambassadors then go back to their countries and pass national laws to conform to international laws. Just think of one, Malcolm Turnbull and the control of water. Now he has two masters. He could have chosen either. One is written into the Constitution of Australia, which says, under clause 100, the Commonwealth shall not, by any law or regulation of trade or commerce, abridge the right of the states to the use of all the residents therein, to the use of waters for rivers, for irrigation. That's one. That's the authority he's supposed to follow. The other one started in 1992 in the United Nations, which was the move for global control of water. If you think all this started just in drugs recently, that's rubbish. It started in 1992, that is 15 years ago, when it was planned to internationalize the whole control of water upon the face of this earth. It's blasphemous apart from anything else. We have seen in our time the demise of the role of the citizen, as President Clinton put in place a structure to build on the foundation set up by President Ronald Reagan that would foster the role of business in the affairs of government with his Reinventing America. Citizens are no longer citizens, but customers. At every turn today, government assets are being sold off at every level. Could be Australia, couldn't it? Prisons to private corporations, toll roads to private corporations, various military functions go to the most interested bidder. Although we are told government is getting smaller, the contracted out services still paid for with taxpayer dollars are rising, thus making the overall government much bigger. With every public-private partnership set up, the structure and purpose of government is changing from the traditional structure that we grew up with. We are told the reason for it is the level of government debt. How could it be that the greatest country in the world is bankrupt and indebted to the Saudi Arabians, the Chinese, and the Japanese? Something is very wrong with this picture. For the first time in history, we are seeing capitalism take over the world. Geopolitical expert Terry Hayfield tells me that the only way to true communism is through capitalism. This 21st century capitalism is not only through public-private partnership and privatization, which was orchestrated by the World Bank and the United Nations, but it results in the system itself. Capitalism is an ism, like socialism, fascism, and communism. As such, it needs a constant stream of new products, new customers, new markets. In other words, capitalism is the yeast, and it is exploding. While capitalism has a lot of positives, it also has a lot of negatives. People are expendable. You don't meet quota, you're gone. It's ruthless, for whichever company gets a contract is the company that stays ahead of the dragon that is chasing it. Government is now feeding the insatiable hunger of capitalism by selling off its prized possessions, while legislators are enthralled at the money they will get for the sale of the asset. Once it is gone, it is gone. Government is for sale, and the corporation is there to buy it up. Just ask the World Bank and IMF, just ask the European Union. If any country wants in, they have to privatize and sell off government assets. I remember talking to a former Comecon official, that was the communist common market, if you like, or commercial enterprise, several years ago, who did not understand why his country had to sell off their state assets. I wonder if he's figured out the massive thievery that is going on, all in the name of joining the European Union or in coming into compliance with strong-armed World Bank policies. For the first time in history, all of the currencies of the countries of the world float against one another. This system allows the rich and powerful to bring countries which are not compliant into obedience. Never before in history was there a way to bring a country to its knees in a split second that did not take an invasion of men and soldiers. Now, any central bank or a group of central bankers or powerful international bankers can teach the country a lesson by selling its currency. Ask Mr. George Soros. It's interesting to note that one of the reasons why Napoleon lost his foothold in Europe was that he was using gold while the Rothschilds were using debt. For the first time in history, foreign countries are selling American dollars. They do not want our currency. This is the American talking. The Chinese have too much, the Japanese have too much, and so does everyone else. Under a policy devised by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and I didn't know this, countries want to buy oil in currencies other than the dollar. The euro, a 5-year-old currency, has just overtaken the dollar in worldwide usage. The inflation that will ensue as the dollar becomes worthless is a real concern. For the first time in history, we have the various continents of the world being divided up into free trade zones. While we're all familiar with the European Union, America, Canada and Mexico are now part of the NAFTA portion of the Americas. We, the people, have been left out of the legislative process, and as if under wraps from us, the government has passed 5 major transportation bills to tie these 3 countries together by a new 21st century transportation infrastructure comprised of smart roads, high-speed rail networks and new trading routes. That is the toll road. It wasn't long ago that John Anderson, just before he retired here in Australia, said he could see the day coming where every road in Australia was now a toll road. Forget that we've already paid for the wretched things, or most of them. No, now we've got to pay to actually drive the cars on. The first step of joining 3 countries will be augmented by the other 30 countries in this hemisphere through the free trade areas of the Americas, with its own dollar or its own money system, the Amero. This has been done without the knowledge or approval of the majority of Americans. For the first time in our history, Americans have lost their power of representation. Unfortunately, we're not fighting a foreign king, but our own political system. For the first time in our history, it is not a matter of Republican or Democrat, but nationalist versus globalist. In a world without any barriers between the nation state, national sovereignty is a thing of the past. For the first time in history, in 1992, the United Nations changed how the world was ordered. They went from a biblical-based concept of man having dominance over the environment to a pagan one in which the environment has dominance over man. Sustainable development is dictating how the world is to be ordered. Throughout most of the United States, zoning laws called smart growth have been passed. This legislation dictates that the state of the future will only provide infrastructure for specified growth areas and that it will not support non-growth areas. As a result of this overcrowding in specified growth areas, traffic congestion has been exacerbated and property values have jumped substantially. This is a blessing for those who own and a curse for those who do not. For the first time in history, a powerful group of insiders have found a way to control or take control of the assets of the world through sustainable development and its agenda. At every turn, the cost to protect the environment will levy many different types of increased costs for all Americans in order to put environmental rules and regulations in place. We're even discussing it here now. Not just the waters in the rivers, but the waters that falls on your property into your tank will have to be licensed before long if they get their way. And it will happen unless the people say no. There is a move to convert most of the roads across America to toll roads, where travelers can pay a toll for the usage of the road. Furthermore, with electrical deregulation, smart meters are being installed in homes, which will allow the homeowner to pay market prices for energy, be it electrical or gas. As well, smart water meters are also being installed so that we will pay market prices for water usage. In other words, the old ideas of the electrical company buying electricity in bulk and passing on savings to the consumer is out of the window in favor of each of us buying electricity as we use it at market prices. As a result of the GATT World Trade Organization, for the first time in history, our manufacturing base has been shipped to China to take advantage of slave labor. As a result, at every turn, America is being stripped of the ability to maintain its ability to provide for itself. According to Tom Hartman of All Air American Radio, current foreign ownership of the following industries in America is more than 50%. Sound recording industries, commodity contracts, dealing and brokerage, motion picture and sound recording industries, metals and mining, motion picture and video industries, wineries and distilleries, database, directory and other publishers, book publishers, cement, concrete, lime and gypsum products, engine, turbine and power transmission equipment, rubber products, non-metallic mineral products, manufacturing, plastics and rubber products, manufacturing, plastic products, other insurance-related activities, and boiler, tank, and shipping containers. So how do we live since it is our turn, our time? We're not talking about living through the communist revolution in Russia or in China. We're talking about how Americans live in a world government system that has already put on the backs of each of us legal, regulatory, and financial burdens. How do we live once we understand we are in world government and that our government is a proponent of this new world order? Where do we go since there are no new colonies to find on this planet? Perhaps we need to remember that Jesus and the early church were birthed in the middle of world government. Jesus came to save us not only from our sin, but to provide for us a new way of living so that the cares of this world would not overcome us. I believe the only way we can operate, given the reality of world government, is to stay close to God, invite Jesus to our life by asking forgiveness, and then asking him to lead and guide us through the power of the Holy Spirit. And she then has a section on how she believes this now is the only answer. I've written a section that I believe applies to Australia. As Joan Vian rightly pointed out, the last world government movement was in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago, when Caesar, backed by highly trained legions, controlled an empire stretching from Scotland to Palestine, Armenia, and North Africa. There was no vote, and everybody obeyed orders under the threat of death for dissent. It was in this situation that a new faith was born in a Bethlehem stable. Its founder traveled by foot through parts of the Middle East, followed by 12 uneducated peasants, one of whom was a traitor. He had no army, no money or bank, no printing press, no sword. He taught for some 3 years in deserts, on the seashore, and in village squares. Nothing he said was written down until half a century after his death. Yet what he said was so brilliant that it shook the mighty Roman Empire to its foundations and established a new and bigger civilization in the ashes of its subsequent collapse. Central to its message was the whole question of world government and a new world order. Just before his public ministry, Christ was offered the very condition in which we are today. The Prince of Darkness, corruption, murder, and torture took Christ onto a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world. He volunteered to hand all the power over these kingdoms to Christ in exchange for a change in allegiance. Not only did Christ spurn this offer, but spent his 3-year ministry laying the foundations of an alternative kingdom of peace and freedom based on a new commandment, that men and women, instead of killing and exploiting each other, should love each other as he himself loved all human beings. In addition, he established a new volunteer force which would, in service to him, become the agents of change from the kingdom of darkness to a new kingdom of light. He explained how this force, to be called the church, was to work and how it should spread the good news about this approaching kingdom to all the nations that Satan had offered him. Entry to this kingdom required a type of passport in the form of spiritual commitments. Recruits would meet great difficulties and be persecuted, but in the end, under his leadership, they would prevail. He taught them to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Now each of us here today, are heirs of this unfolding kingdom. Our courts, our constitutions, our laws, our freedoms, our history are all based on Christ's teachings. Every day our parliament opens with the self-same words that Christ taught us, "Thy kingdom come." People ask me year after year at this forum, what should we do? Who should we vote for? At this coming election, we will have a number of alliances and minor parties, plus some independents. They are tilting at vast and highly funded party machines, ably supported by a compliant one-eyed media. we almost need a new alliance of alliances. One has to acknowledge the courage of those who are having a go. But without a forthright regeneration of the Christian church, getting its house in order, speaking to the nation, prepared to face ridicule and persecution, acting like a volunteer army in service, straightening out the perversions which continually undermine its doctrine of freedom, denouncing devious politicians, defending the Constitution, condemning the opposing God, the almighty dollar, and above all, praying for help, guidance, and strength in this time of trouble, we will continue to slide towards a precipice called too late. The saddest words in the English language. Thank you very much. Well, if you have any questions, go for it. The only rule is you're not allowed to throw anything at the speaker.
One of the things I found interesting, and if I could just ask the first one, Jeremy, when you mentioned that UNESCO owned a great deal of Australia, that's remarkable. I didn't know that. Could you mention more about it?
All World Heritage areas and World Heritage buildings come under the authority of UNESCO. And Australia has to ask UNESCO permission to do things in there now. And this is the first stage of a program that developed back in the 90s, the late 1990s, where a World Bank was set up by the Rothschilds called the World Environmental Bank, I think it was. And their idea was that if countries got too deeply in debt, the bank would take over their World Heritage areas in exchange for debt relief. It was called debt for equity swaps. Have you heard of the program, debt for equity swaps? Well, that's part of what now faces us. And if we can't handle our foreign debt, which is now over $500 billion, doesn't matter how Peter Costello says we're booming, the day is coming when we're going to lose parts of Australia. Already we're selling our assets. Who gave Howard and Costello permission to sell Telstra? Every poll in Australia showed that the big majority did not want to sell it.
Jeremy, out to Summerfield. But the basic Christianity is speaking about, which is so important to rectify the whole problem. Where do you fit social credit or Douglas credit into this?
I believe, well, I've always believed, I've been a social creditor ever since 1967 when I started lecturing. I believe it is the policy of Christianity. This is not a church. It's not connected to a particular church. It is a policy. But it is the policy which first of all deals with the whole question of debt and how debt operates, releasing human beings into an entirely different type of environment. And therefore, I think it's the answer. But the chance of getting there at the moment means that you've got to defeat the people who control the money system before we can bring in an alternative. So we're all like the mice sitting around saying how nice it would be to get a bell around the cat's neck. But it always comes back to the question, well, who's volunteering? And how do we do it? That's about where we are, I think.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. This is more in support of what you were saying relating to the World Heritage listing. You mentioned the Rockefeller Bank. The entity that they created, they underwrote it unlimited. That was quite unique. What I'd like to walk people through, the land mass of our planet is approximately 1/3 of the surface. There's a point, and I'll get to it, Lindsay. Of that 1/3 of that land mass, 28% of it is now under World Heritage listing. It's quite unique that the bulk of that happened within 18 months of the first satellites being put up. If you look at the areas that lay within that 28% of the land mass, 80% of the undeveloped mineralisation in the world lies in those areas. And I'll give you a couple of examples.
Question?
in Argentina, under the World Heritage listing in their parks, is the greatest undeveloped silver deposit in the world. If you go to the Amazon, again listed, there is the greatest undeveloped tin reserves in the world. If you come to Australia and you have a look at Kakadu National Park, World Heritage listed, the greatest undeveloped uranium resource in the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. I remember the last time I lectured in New Zealand, being shown two things, a map of the mineral deposits and a map of the World Heritage areas, and they just fitted like that, one over the other. And that's only a small example of what you just told us. Dead right.
All this what we've talked about tonight has been thrust upon the majority of the population without their knowledge. Nobody's got a clue what's going on. A group in the room here have. But it must descend to a stage where it starts to affect everybody, where they've lost their rights and they've lost their land and all the rest of it. Do you agree, well, like you mentioned Section 100 of the Constitution, that's basically a piece of paper unless we uphold it. Now, my point is that not every individual, do you agree that nothing will change until every individual decides that that's far enough and draws the line and then starts to do something about it, whether it's politically or just any way they can?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
I agree 100%, Kevin. There's only one problem with that. How do you find the issue where people will draw the line? Because I draw the line on water, somebody else draws it on education, somebody else on the level of taxation, and it's only now and again you can get an issue that is so clear and so simple that everybody says, right, now we join together on this one. It happened on the last time they tried to bring the ID card. And it's going to happen again, but I'm not sure which issue it's going to be. But yes, it's coming. I'll tell you this. The man that I learned from, Eric Butler, he came here once or twice. If ever a man was attacked, it was him. But he always used to say to his audience, if you have not suffered enough, it's your God-given right to suffer a little bit more. And we're going to suffer a lot more until Australians regain this strange thing in the back called the backbone and stand up and really take to their politicians. I wouldn't be a politician at that time. It's a very interesting question, just that deviating a little bit, this whole question of Islamic invasion of the West. I wrote to the national head of one of the biggest churches in Australia, no names, no patriot. And I said, how come in the worst drought in our history we can't have a national Australian Day of Prayer for rain? We did it during the war. The King used to call all the people together in every country of the Commonwealth, including Britain, and he used to say, we're in deep trouble, can we all pray together? And millions and millions of people came out. They did it at Dunkirk, they did it at the Normandy landing, etc., etc. When I was in New Zealand last, a little church over there, when at the end of the war, the King George VI, suggested that all people of the Commonwealth should pray for peace. And they started a prayer chain that's gone 24 hours a day ever since that date in 1945. Night and day, they have teams come in and they pray there. You've got to take your hat off to them. Now, I was thinking of this, I got the letter back from the head of this national church. He said, oh, it's so difficult. And he said, apart from anything else, we might be misunderstood. And then he had the ultimate statement of all, we could be seen to be trying to manipulate God. Now we have lost the plot. And a week ago, give him his due, a sheikh of the Islamic faith said the reason we've got a drought is because we're too damn proud to pray for an answer. And he at least had the guts to come out. Our church now is so soft and weak and sloppy that we've lost the plot. And until we get back to a church that really stands up to be counted, it doesn't matter what we do about voting in the next election. We're gone. We've got to have a regeneration of the spirit that built this country.
Thank you, Jeremy.